Hello everyone, my name is Anthony Viestebison and welcome to the first episode of Through the Looking Glass, a podcast examining issues related to foreign policy and foreign affairs, examining current global affairs and reflecting on pressing questions, and providing thoughts from a young adult's perspective and taking a look at this confusing world through the looking glass. My name is Anthony Viestebison. I am a freelance writer. I contribute to a number of online syndications such as the Jerusalem Post, RA Magazine, and The Region. My area of focus is the Middle East and North African region, with a specific attention to minority rights, as well as to conflict and foreign policy analysis. Today's episode will be covering the topic of ISIS repatriation and what to do about the current issue of Daesh volunteers and who are currently imprisoned in places such as Syria and Iraq, as well as the global issue to do with radicalization and potential thoughts on what should happen to these fighters and their families. So as you can see, the question is what should be done about Daesh volunteers. So how this is going to really work is that I'm going to, for the first 40 to 50 minutes, just cover the topic a bit, offer my thoughts on the issue, and then the last 20 minutes, if there's anyone who wishes, the last 30 minutes, if there's anyone who wishes to come on and ask a question or give their own thoughts on this related matter, then they can do so. But without further ado, let's get this started. So, since the end of the Caliphate, or Daesh, by the way, is an Arabic name for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, a transnational jihadist operation that expanded across Syria and Iraq, as well as is active in other areas such as in Nigeria and in Indonesia with their affiliate groups like Boko Haram and al-Shabaab. This group was started by a man by the name of Zarqawi in the late 1990s, went under a different name at that time, but it evolved into what we know today in 2014 with the announcement of the start of a caliphate, or a proto-state, headed by the then Caliph Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in June of 2014. It expanded across Iraq and Syria, mainly spreading from the Al-Anbar province in Iraq all the way to Mosul, where it declared its de facto caliphate capital in Iraq, and it expanded all the way to Syria, where it declared its de facto caliphate in Raqqa, in the area. From 2014 all the way to 2017, the group received over 80,000 foreign fighters from across the globe, as well as local fighters who joined up the ranks and swore allegiance to Baghdadi's proto-state. This state, built on a very extremist ideology of Salafi jihadism, declared that it was the only caliphate and that all other organizations such as Al-Qaeda and their affiliates were not modeling correctly, and that the only way towards true jihad and the true realization of this caliphate is through, of course, the Islamic State's caliphate. That is what they declared. They had a number of online media publications that they produced their propaganda in. Most notably, Dabik was their international magazine, and they had a number of different online media presence where they spread their ISIS propaganda, and most notably things such as the beheading of James Foley and other humanitarian workers in Syria, where they filmed this brutal footage and mass-produced it to their followers in an attempt to build up the support for this caliphate, in other words. If we fast forward a bit forward, In 2016, at the end of 2016, the Syrian Democratic Forces, a multi-ethnic coalition of Syrian Arabs, Kurds, Assyrians, and so on, formed under their ranks to fight the Islamic State with the backing of the US-led coalition against ISIS, a global coalition consisting of 40-plus nations in the pursuit of defeating the Islamic State Caliphate in both Iraq and Syria. The SDF started a campaign at the end of 2016 under the Operations Room of Operations Wrath of Euphrates, whereby the mission was to destroy and to liberate those under the yoke of the tyranny that is the Islamic State. This campaign lasted all the way until May of 2017, where Raqqa was liberated from ISIS in the subsequent weeks to months. In Iraq, at that same time, Mosul became the center of a huge concerted effort by the coalition to rid the de facto capital in Iraq from the yoke of ISIS tyranny. This ended in a military victory in the liberation of Mosul by the Iraqi security forces, Peshmerga, and Hashd al-Shabi. Since then, ISIS's caliphate has significantly been reduced over the next couple of months to years, with in December 2017 with Haider al-Abdi declaring victory over the Islamic Caliphate on behalf of the state of Iraq, and with the SDF doing the same towards the beginning of 2019 with the liberation of the Hajjan pocket in Syria, ending the physical presence of ISIS's proto-state in Syria. Since the liberation of Hajin, as you can see, we have fighters over here that have been taken taken captive by the Syrian Democratic Forces. These fighters surrendered en masse, while others, of course, died in the fighting to protect their last remnants of their caliphate. Of the people that surrendered, there were over 60,000 associated Islamic State volunteers, mostly women and children, who ended up being in the captivity of the Syrian Democratic Forces in Syria alone. Most of these families, including about 70% of those people being under the age of 18. This is statistics as of the OCH, or the Syria Humanitarian Response in al-Hol camp, Situation Report number 2 from the 17th of April 2019, which states that around 70% of al-Hol camp, which is still a camp for displaced, specifically mostly displaced ISIS volunteers and mostly their family members, women and children, in the northeast of Syria. Around 70% of the camp population is under the age of 18. So of the 73,000 people that are in the al-Hol camp, of those, about over 50%, you could say. So we could say over 50,000 of those, over 40,000 of those people are under the age of 18, and 65% are under the age of 12. So there's a huge portion of the camp that consists of women and children, to boil a long story short. These numbers, of course, have changed over the years. In August of 2019, we had numbers of upwards to about 68,000, over 68,000 in al-Hol camp, with a further 1,798 in Roj camp, 8,780 in al-Rashash, and 3,776 from Mabroka. And these, of course, include IDPs as well as Iraqis and third country nationals. Of the population of these family members specifically. I'll get to the sort of the fighters, if you want to call it, first. The fighters that were under captivity, or still under captivity, that were captured by the Syrian Democratic Forces range above the number of 5,000. So there are about roughly 5,000, 6,000 fighters that are currently under the control of the Syrian Democratic Forces that come from over 40 different nations across the globe. So these are foreign volunteers that came by to join the Islamic State and who have been captured by ISIS. Captured by the Syrian Democratic Forces. Pardon my language on that. Most of these volunteers that came to fight for the Islamic State, they came from countries such as Great Britain, France, Tunisia, Turkey, the United States, Australia, and other such countries. So there's over 40 different nations of people that currently are under the captivity, or in captivity, by the Syrian Democratic Forces in Syria alone. There's of course many in Iraq as well, under the Iraqi government's control and the Iraqi security forces. And of course, this is just taking Syria and Iraq alone. There are thousands others that we can talk about in Nigeria and in places like Indonesia. But for the purpose of this conversation that we're going to be having, we're going to be mostly focusing on Syria and Iraq. Those other areas, the reason why I'm not taking too much of a focus on them is because the fighting in those areas is still pretty much ongoing, even though it is technically ongoing in Syria and in Iraq with the fight against ISIS sleeper cells. What has not been as much of a problem in comparison to Nigeria in that is that most of the forces such as the Syrian Democratic Forces and Iraqi security forces, or Iraqi CT forces backed by the Combined Joint Task Forces Operation Inherent Resolve, which is of course the coalition's main military campaign and mission to defeat the Islamic State. They are still operating in Iraq and Syria with fighting ISIS sleeper cells. However, the main proto-state where ISIS declared itself has been destroyed, with Baghdadi, of course, being killed himself in Idlib province in October of 2019. Now, and also the fact that in Nigeria there is still ongoing fighting with other such groups such as Boko Haram and others affiliates. Now, on this topic, really, we have to also focus on a number of issues regarding Syria and Iraq when it comes to the imprisonment of these fighters. Because since I've given you now just a brief overview of the situation that is going on over there, I think I find it now appropriate to move on to talking about such camps and the issue of radicalization in these camps. Now, the camps that I'm going to be focusing on mainly are camps such as al-Hol and al-Hol. Now, al-Hol is the biggest of these many IDP camps in the northeast of Syria that has mostly ISIS volunteers. So people essentially who were married to ISIS fighters, who bore children with ISIS fighters, and who came from other nations to wed or to have children with ISIS fighters. And as I mentioned to you, as of the current statistics as provided by the Rojava Information Center, which I will provide links for in the description box after I've completed this episode, the current population at the moment is about 66,000 within al-Hol camp. So that includes the women and includes the children as well when it comes to ISIS volunteers. In this camp, as of January 2020, around about 4,000 plus 1,430 foreigners have left the camp since June of 2019. However, the numbers are very slow and still ongoing as countries take back a limited supply of the people that they can take back. Now, we'll come back to this when we're talking about repatriation of these fighters and whether or not that should actually happen, because this is a big talking point at least a couple of months ago. Unfortunately, with the COVID outbreak, it's kind of slowed things down, of course, but that doesn't mean that since things have slowed down, that doesn't mean that these things have just evaporated and don't exist anymore. We still have to remember that when I'm talking about these issues, and I'll get back to the main issue, I'm sorry for going off on one tangent, but when I'm talking about these issues, I'm doing so in the context of them being ongoing. So even though the mainstream media, and I don't know, that's a bit cliche to say, but even though mainstream media and even alternative media don't necessarily talk about this issue as much anymore, it's still a pressing issue, especially with people of the area. Now, let's quickly go to the next slide. Now, I'm going to just take an example of these foreign volunteers and the importance, I guess, that we need to make and focus on when we're talking about this issue. Now, there's roughly, as I mentioned before, 5,000 to 6,000 foreign nationals. These are basically fighters that have come from other countries that are currently in SDF captivity. Now, as you can see on the slide, you can see this is just an example of a detention center where ISIS fighters that were captured in places like Kajin Pocket exist at the moment in a state of real limbo. Because this comes onto our first major issue when it comes to this topic, is the idea of repatriation and whether or not ISIS fighters and family members should be repatriated. Now, what is repatriation? That's when a nation or organization, whatever you want to call it, mostly nation states, take back nationals, whether they be in different countries or even from a different country, and accept them within the original country or the home country. So in this case, what does it mean? It means essentially, to put it in basic terms, that should countries like Australia, like the United States, like Great Britain, or like any EU nation take back these fighters who came originally from places, as I mentioned before, Australia, United States, Great Britain, and EU, should they take back their fighters now that they are captured? There are a lot of arguments that I've heard on this issue, and I do want to raise a couple of them. Now, firstly, we have to remember that these fighters still pose a great deal of risk to states. Yes, they are now in the detention of the Syrian Democratic Forces as well as the Iraqi security forces in Iraq, but that does not mean that they are less a threat to national security of any of these states. Now, this is the argument. What I've said right there is the gist really of a lot of the reasons for why states such as Great Britain have not repatriated as much fighters as they could. Their argument is that these fighters were left for Syria and Iraq to fight for the Islamic State, and by doing that they have renounced their citizenship and should not be taken back by the home country, such as Great Britain. That's some of the arguments I have heard. The main issue with this is that, yes, these fighters are dangerous. Yes, they do pose a national security issue. However, fundamentally, these fighters came from countries such as Great Britain, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Why should it be the responsibility of a non-state actor, such as the Syrian Democratic Forces, to keep these prisoners when they do not originate from the soil of Syria or Iraq? Why should they keep them? The question that I posed is you could say the counter argument, or the opposite side to the issue of repatriation. Why should it be the responsibility of non-state actors who themselves, may I just say, are existing in very precarious situations? So we're talking about, in Syria alone, there's a conflict going on, the wider Syria. This is, of course, we don't need to get into it, but as I've mentioned before on this channel, this conflict has been ongoing for quite some time, and the Syrian state does not necessarily have the infrastructure or even the legal system to appropriately, let's put it that way, trial these individuals or take responsibility for these individuals. As for the Syrian Democratic Forces, who themselves are dealing with the weight of not only economic sanctions as of currently by the Caesar Act passed by the United States, which essentially renders the Syrian state culpable, or those responsible for crimes by the Syrian state are essentially sanctioned by the US government. This has meant that the Syrian lira has been a free fall, with, I think about 3,100 last time I checked, Syrian lira to $1. With that precarious economic situation, coupled with the fact that the Syrian Democratic Forces have had to deal with not only an invasion by the Turkish state and its auxiliary forces with the Turkish Free Syrian Army and Syrian National Army, but also, thirdly, have had to deal with mass displacement of over 300,000. You got to remember that at the end of the Hajan campaign, which, may I just say, there's a continuing campaign that has been done in places like Deir ez-Zor in the east of the country, that is being done by affiliate councils to the Syrian Democratic Forces, such as the Deir ez-Zor Military Council, in cooperation with US Special Forces and Coalition Special Forces, are currently at the moment dealing with the Islamic State cells, so sleeper cells mostly, who have been themselves setting fire to places such as wheat fields, and who themselves are causing a great deal of instability. When you put all these factors into consideration, as well as another factor that the Syrian Democratic Forces are, as well as the wider administration of the self-administration of North and East Syria, which is the de facto government in the northeast, does not have the resources, as of currently, to deal with continued keeping of these fighters, it just poses a potential risk that these fighters can escape, and if they do escape, they have a potential of posing a national security threat to places such as Great Britain and to the United States and to places like Australia and other EU states, as well as non-EU states, if they are not handled. This is one of the issues that was raised by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who said that states should be responsible and take back their fighters and their volunteers, whether they be fighters that are in SDF captivity, or whether they be a wife or a child of a ISIS member. Unfortunately, a lot of countries have gone the route of the UK, with cases such as this lady over here, whose name is Shamima, I think, if I can pronounce her name correctly, Shamima Begum, who herself was a lady who left to join the UK at age 15 and left to join ISIS. And what happened is that she got into the captivity of the Syrian Democratic Forces, and there was a controversy that is still ongoing, may I say, that involves the fact that the UK government essentially renounced the citizenship of Shamima Begum rather than accept her and take responsibility for her in the area. This sparked a great deal of controversy and a great deal of questions regarding what should be done about ISIS fighters, which I've mentioned before. Okay? Yeah. Sure. Okay. Yeah, which I've mentioned before. Now, when it comes to people like Shamima, my personal view is that the UK government should take responsibility for her, as well as for other Daesh volunteers, whether they be fighters or whether they be wives or children of these organizations and of these countries. I don't think it is a responsible thing for a state actor like the United Kingdom, with a robust legislation and robust legislator, to, as well as robust justice system in general, to be giving citizens, former citizens may I say, regardless if we're talking about before her citizenship was renounced, it should be the responsibility of the United Kingdom as well as other states to take back their volunteers and to put them on trial and essentially take responsibility for these individuals. They should not be responsible, essentially, and I'm saying that states actors are being irresponsible when they give, or you could say outsource, their judicial procedure on these individuals to non-state actors like the Syrian Democratic Forces or the Iraqi security forces. I am not saying that these forces are incapable of trialing these individuals. What I am saying is that they don't have the necessary resources or the means to trial effectively these individuals and to provide justice for the victims of the Islamic State. That's what we must remember over here. That's not happening because of the circumstances that I've mentioned, the lack of funding, the precarious situation, the questionable judicial systems of the Syrian state and of the Iraqi state. Now, I want to mention on the topic of Iraq, Iraq currently is taking back a lot of its ISIS fighters and putting them on trial in dubious situation, I would say, without proper legal representation, or actually what we would call in the West a proper judicial system in general. They're putting these fighters on trial and subsequent volunteers as well, and essentially either sentencing them to death or sentencing them to life. Now, for a lot of people listening to this in the future, they may think this is not such a bad thing. I mean, these people committed mass genocide. Why should I give a crap about whether or not they die or whether they serve long prison sentences? And I can understand that sentiment. However, I want to just remind people that there's a standard by which the least justice must be done in order to do positive to the memory of victims of these people. In proper trials that we have seen in places such as the former Yugoslavia and with the Hague and the ICTYM, not ICTYM, the ICTY, or the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, we saw members that were responsible for mass genocides such as Srebrenica and other such genocides and atrocities within the states of the former Yugoslavia. We saw them be brought to justice. We also saw the genocide at Srebrenica be classed as a genocide under these tribunals, and that actually has helped develop a legal precedent that is necessary for how especially things like the International Criminal Court operates in the world. It sets the proper legal precedent. It also keeps a documentation of the faults of the Islamic State, of course, and does justice essentially, or at least tries its best to record the injustices posed to victims of the Islamic State, who are really the true victims. It's not these people over here. We're not talking about the fighters. We're not talking about the volunteers who came and joined and married these Islamic State fighters. We're not talking about the children necessarily, although we will be talking about them a bit later when we talk about the radicalization of these individuals, when we're talking about the al-Hol camp. We must remember that these ISIS fighters are not the victims, and they will never be the victims. And I'm not saying they will ever be the victims. The real victims are the people that they have brought to death and that they have terrorized and traumatized, really. However, for the sake of justice for them, there needs to be a proper judicial system and judicial process in place, a proper legal mechanism for the trialing of these fighters. And unfortunately, the Iraqi state does not have that robust of a judicial system. And what it does instead is it trials individuals based on membership. So not whether or not they are guilty or not, just whether or not they are a member, which is a very different case, because you get the case of potential innocent people who have been accused of being or working with the Islamic State being put on trial and essentially being either killed or sentenced to long jail time, and so on. And then you have the knock-on effect that their families also get that heat by the victims of the Islamic State out of pure retribution. So what we have in the process in places such as Iraq, we also have to mention the fact that non-state actors such as the Hashd al-Shabi, who is a Shia extremist organization backed by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, has been actually essentially implementing how you can say what's the process again, has implemented rather old school, quote unquote old school form of retribution towards these, or the prisoners that it had that were accused of being the Islamic State. We would call this sort of can be seen in places such as Mosul, where you had videos of people accused of being part of the Islamic State being thrown off of bridges and being shot and killed, just without even trial, without even any other, how you can say, verification, nothing at all, just pure blind retribution. Now, a lot of people who may not care much about justice may think that, okay, the Islamic State deserves that. I would say that, I can understand that sentiment, but as I mentioned, out of principle and out of precedent, there has to be a formal way of doing things. There has to be a system of laws and justice that we implement, or else we are no better than the very things we seek to contain or seek to oppose, which is my argument, is we have to do better. And that's the argument of people that have written reports on this, such as what we can call it. There was a report written by the Rojava Information Center, and it's available on the Rojava Information Center, where we could talk it, written by Impunity Watch, PAX, and Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression. We have recommendations of essentially supporting the Iraqi judiciary system to implement fair trials and to remove the possibility of the death penalty, and to collect and preserve evidence for use in trials elsewhere, including via effective victim participation and outreach. That includes the support of the Iraqi state and it's Iraqi state and civil society to address victims' full range of needs beyond criminal justice. Then, of course, when it comes to Syria, same situation, except we have to implement, because the case when it comes to Iraq, Iraq's one matter. Then we have Syria. Now, as mentioned before, Syria in itself is dealing with a civil war. It's dealing with the prospect of essentially large-scale violence, where the only system that is in place is a de facto tyrannical system, which in itself is already responsible for hundreds of thousands of Syrian deaths. It's not an effective tool for the trial of such individuals, because it essentially gives a blank check. It gives impunity to the Syrian state, who itself has committed mass atrocities against its own people. When you give impunity to the state and essentially give it the free rein to do trials against the Islamic State, it loses that punch, because it's essentially like Nazi Germany, or charging or putting to death the Soviet Union, or vice versa. You have two tyrannical entities, one being a non-state actor and one being a state actor, and they all themselves essentially don't have that level of you could say partiality, legal rigidity, and so on. So one of the proposals made by the Roche Information Center in this report, which I'll link in the description box when I'm done this podcast, is to reinforce or enact national legislation allowing for extraterritorial investigation and prosecution of international crimes by all parties committed on Syrian territory in courts in Europe and elsewhere. So what does that mean? That means allowing external actors, such as in the case of legal mechanisms created by the United Nations Security Council in the former Yugoslavia, such as the ICTY, which was a tribunal set up in The Hague, in the Netherlands, to essentially trial those individuals responsible for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and vast violation of decency. These individuals were put on trial, as I mentioned before, in the cases like Srebrenica and other such massacres, and brought to justice. And we have records for that. A similar process, in my opinion, should be made in places such as Syria. Okay? Now, it mentions an impartial, independent mechanism. So that would assume a mechanism, as I mentioned before, like the RCTY. And this is actually being recommended by the spokesperson for the Syrian Democratic Forces, named one of the most important, you could say, SDF spokespeople is that of Mustafa Bali, who actually said that there should be an international tribunal set up for the Islamic State, and I agree full-heartedly. However, there has been a number of issues raised on that point that I do need to address, because the problem with having such a system is that you need the states, or you need like some form of state actors themselves agreeing to the process and agreeing to the effective sort of, that's why I mentioned before, the legislation, extraterritorial investigation. It needs to be approved by the state, and if the state doesn't approve by it, which the Syrian state is unlikely to do despite the nature of the criminal activity, because that means essentially that it would require, if legislation were to be enacted by the Syrian state, it would require, I would actually think that they would most likely ask for the legitimation of their regime, which is something that the international community is not prepared to do when it comes to Syria. Therefore, we have a dilemma that the Syrian state essentially will not allow such legislation to pass, and therefore the likelihood of a tribunal coming into existence is highly unlikely, unless it's done more actively in a different manner. There has been a UN Security Council resolution passed on this matter, and that resolution happens to be, if I can just get the UN resolution out, it's UN Security Council Resolution 2379, which created UNITAD, and that's essentially the proposal for an ISIS tribunal, however also an investigation into the crimes of those ISIS members. And that's been done in Iraq mostly. It's the closest thing that has been, you could say, internationally approved for some form of reckoning to those who fought for the Islamic State. Sorry about that, just a bit of a technical difficulty there. Those are some of the issues for when it comes to trialing ISIS fighters and the nature of the beast when it comes to this issue. And they just sort of summarize briefly, has to do with the fact that judicial systems within Iraq and Syria are inherently flawed, which provides a poor standard of delivering justice. You have the case where in Iraq you have potential for innocents to be convicted and killed or sent into jail unlawfully without a proper trial, because, as I said before, in Iraq they only trial individuals based on their membership. So whether or not, if they're accused of being a member, they're pretty much put out by the security forces and taken off to jail, where they will be interrogated and likely forced to admit or potentially be trialed by these Iraqi courts, which they themselves have flawed systems, as I mentioned before. That's just one matter. Then we could look at the wider context of Iraq in general, the poor infrastructure and poor funding to these judicial bodies, as well as the more retributive justice employed by groups such as Hashd al-Shabi, a Shia extremist militia in Iraq that's under the sponsorship of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which itself essentially killed in barbaric ways and inhumane ways those accused of being a part of the Islamic State. In the cases of Syria, you have a problem with the whole state itself being embroiled in a civil war. You have the issue of a inherently flawed judicial system and the problem of risking legitimizing the Assad regime in efforts to trial ISIS fighters and essentially undermining the process for justice. You then also have the problem with the lack of funding to the Syrian Democratic Forces, as well as other existential issues such as the invasion of the northeast by Turkey, the complications brought by mass displacement, as well as other such matters. And this is all issues that need to be addressed and have to be addressed in order for any form of specific justice to be done. So this is the nature of the beast and the nature of what is happening, at least when it comes to Iraq and Syria on the trial front, and the problems to do with trialing these individuals for their barbarity. Okay. 1 second. Yeah. Now, to actually go back to this lady over here, Shamam, never pronounce her name right, but I don't think much people would mind, Shamima. With cases of her, she's just one out of thousands, as I mentioned to you before, potentially over 30,000 women and children, over 50,000, 66,000 IDPs currently exist within al-Hol camp. They exist within the camp that has been set up in the northeast to deal with these individuals that have voluntarily gone to the Islamic State. The problem with them is that a lot of the time they are allowed to operate in that camp without any huge change to their situation. So what do I mean by that? What you have with al-Hol camp, to give an example, is you have thousands of women and children, all who lived under for some time and who have been radicalized by the Islamic State. You have them existing in one small area for a large amount of time. These individuals are allowed to radicalize their children. They are allowed to make equipment, especially ordnance, that are a risk to civilian life. They are allowed to have their own form of autonomy in the camp, and they are allowed to exist in this camp despite there being understaffing when it comes to protecting this camp and making sure that these people cannot leave this camp. Now, just to put it into perspective, imagine if you have 66,000 people and only 400 guards essentially looking after a small de facto melting pot for radicalization and extremism. You have 400 guards who patrol, or around 400 guards of the Syrian Democratic Forces that are responsible for patrolling this camp and making sure that this camp is secure, that is, it is checked, and making sure that people cannot escape. Now, this is a big issue because, as I mentioned before, with the lack of funding and lack of support for the Syrian Democratic Forces, and the reluctance, really, by a lot of state actors to take back their fighters, you have a case now where you have thousands of foreign nationals existing within the camp. About 16%, I think I read last time, according to the International Center for Counterterrorism, a report that was made by The Hague's Gina Fail in October of 2019, where she noted that around 16% of foreign nationals who traveled to join the group in Iraq and Syria, together with an unknown number of locals, now live in al-Hol camp. So that is a significant proportion. That's around over 10,000 people. That's how much numbers we're dealing with. Over 10,000 people from different nations, along with just the nationals. So that's, as I said before, 66,000 people existing within a small space where you have a lot of radicalized women who you can see by the interviews that France 24 has done with these women and their children, who genuinely believe in the Islamic State's values and who believe in the extremity of this organization and believe that they should create another caliphate under the direction of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and his successor, who themselves have access to internet, may I just say, who have themselves little small businesses where they can fund their dangerous activity, such as the building of explosives and other such devices, and who themselves are still radicalizing their children, actually teaching their children for the coming jihad, as they put it. This is a dangerous situation. It's a very dangerous situation on many fronts. One of the fronts being that you have essentially young kids who aren't being repatriated by their nation states, although that is coming slowly by countries like Finland and Bosnia and other such countries, who they are repatriating some of their people, but it's a very, very slow process. And the AANES, or the Self-Administration of North and East Syria, is still dealing with that issue. They're still dealing with people repatriating their citizens, rightfully so. However, a lot of countries are not forthcoming. I believe my own country in Australia has said that any person who voluntarily went out to go fight with the Islamic State will have their citizenship revoked and will no longer be citizens of Australia. Essentially, Australia, like Great Britain, are washing their hands of responsibility for these individuals. On that matter, I just want to also say that one of the reasons why a lot of these states are doing this as well is because they are afraid that, I would suspect, they are afraid, and this is, I guess you could say, speculative as well as based on part of what I've read, but they are afraid, really, of these individuals returning back, getting trial, but not getting a long sentence. So after 20 years or so, they're out on the streets again doing terrorist activities. What they do then is outsourcing their justice to states such as I mentioned, such as Iraq, who have much more, as I said, less judicial review, much more shady activity when it comes to processing and comes to trials they're essentially allowing these states and these non-state actors, such as the PMU, to be the judge, jury, and executor of their former citizens. And I mentioned already why this is a problem, essentially because you relinquish whatever quote-unquote claim you have to international justice and law if you yourself cannot take responsibility for the people who came from your own states and came to your own states and essentially from your own states and essentially committed mass atrocities against indigenous people such as the Yazidis. It's something that must be considered and something that we have to actually also just really reflect on. But to get back to al-Hol camp, there's a brilliant article that actually was written by the Telegraph, I believe, or it's Telegraph, on the camps, essentially al-Hol camp. It's done by a Haval of mine named Kaki. I'm hoping I didn't mispronounce his name, but if I did, I do sincerely apologize if you watch this later. But he helped individuals from a number of different intelligence agencies write up a brilliant article, which I will link to in the description box once I've done this podcast. He did mention essentially that in these camps, they have small businesses that get their funding from public funds, essentially, where they present themselves as a lot of these women. We're talking about normal ISIS volunteer women who are living in al-Hol camp. How they've set themselves up is that you have vast networks that have been created by these women to monitor the activities of other women. Almost the akin to some form of muqarabat in the al-Hol camp. Now, the Daesh, or the internal security for the Syrian Democratic Forces, has people inside the camp monitoring this. And Kaki, really, with his information he's gotten, he's done this quite rigidly. He's looked through these channels. Most of these channels come in Russian, German, and Arabic, essentially, where you have these women who show off their goods. So we'll say whether they be pictures or whether they be some form of sympathy drive to try get some form of public funding. And some of the organizations that help in this endeavor are like donation pages like For Our Free Our Sisters, Justice for Sisters, Help for Sisters, aka Free Akwat, Eliara, Larger Hall, Kopilika, Ahira, Hall, and others, which regularly upload pictures and messages from the camps. So these networks, they act to help fund these radicals within the camp. That's one element. Now you may wonder how are these people communicating if they're not if they're monitored and guarded. Well, as I mentioned to you before, there's only really about 400 or so. I believe that's the last time I checked. 400 guards guarding the Syrian Democratic Forces' al-Hol camp. And as you can imagine, if you're guarding that amount of people, which is about 66,000, you're not going to do a thorough job. There's also going to be the case that you have illegal networks. You have Telegram channels and other such networks, where, as well as WhatsApp, where these women use these networks in order to not only spread their understanding of camp life, but also information to other girls and also to monitor other girls. Like there's examples within this article that Kaki has noted. He shows examples of where women will take pictures of other women who may have spoken to Daesh, which is the internal security for the camp, who have spoken to these women, and what happens at the end of them is that these women are later stabbed or killed, because a lot of killings happen within the camp just based on this. It's almost like itself a totalitarian quasi-state within this camp. Besides that, a much worse thing is happening. Besides this, I know that you may think, how can this go on? How can this actually go on without anything being done about it? Well, to the fairness of the Syrian Democratic Forces, they are trying their best. Like, you have to remember, as I mentioned before, there's a lack of resources that are available to these people. Like, how on earth are they supposed to monitor a camp of 66,000 people, okay, with 400 guards, with occasional times where there's places where individuals can do certain things, they know the routines and that. How can they possibly manage this place properly when they themselves are dealing with an existential crisis from Turkey and Turkish forces? They're dealing themselves with the Assad regime as well and their proxies. They're dealing with their own problems of lack of support and a reluctant, really, international community to take back these fighters. It's a hard sell. It's a hard not to understand where they're coming from on this matter. Not to say that they couldn't do more, but here's the main fact of the matter is that what are they supposed to do if these countries aren't taking back their citizens? They're just going to be keeping these people there until they can either move them off to Iraq or just wait to see what happens, really, or wait for other countries to get them. That's just how it's going to work, for the moment at least. Now, when it comes to what Kaki mentions with his information gathering, and he's a brilliant guy, he's a brilliant individual, brilliant researcher. I highly recommend you. I'll link all the stuff in the description box once I'm done. But he's highlighted so much Facebook accounts of this woman where they actually preach their radical ideology. They still get information from the outside, like messages, or from different networks and the spokesperson for the Islamic State as well. They have their children, there's pictures of their children as well, doing exercises, training in jihad. Like, you have a huge, as I mentioned to you, thousands of children, many of whom are still connected to their mother, who herself is radical. They're getting training within these camps, and that's a worrying thing because they could be potential jihadists of tomorrow if left unchecked. This poses another national security issue that must be taken up by states and even non-state actors to some degree. Is, should these people be allowed to operate like this unchecked? What is the implications of that? If, from a security standpoint, a national security standpoint, you essentially allowing future jihadists who could potentially pose a threat to your national security to exist, it's a little bit irresponsible, to say the least. And it causes unnecessary death in the future if left unchecked. Again, we must acknowledge this. We have to recognize this. And this is a growing issue in, as I mentioned to you, it's a growing issue in al-Hol camp. More and more people every single month, you could say, as I mentioned to you by the Rojava Information Center, is that they've estimated that, if I can just put the record about, give me a second, sorry for the bit of it, I just want to get the statistics up again. Yeah, as I said before, 4,000 Syrians and 1,430 foreigners have left al-Hol since June of 2019. This is out of what used to be 73,000 people. That's not enough. The camp's already overpopulated. It's already itself has a little bit of autonomy. It's already poorly guarded. So it's a melting pot for potential disaster. And that's not even considering future calamities. There's a very pressing issue that must be noted, that the Syrian Democratic Forces, as I mentioned to you, are dealing with an existential crisis from Turkish-backed auxiliary forces in the form of the Syrian National Army and Turkish Free Syrian Army in the northeast of the country, with operations such as Operation Peace Spring. This operation displaced 300,000 people, which already put it, on addition to other previous operations such as Operation Olive Branch, puts a lot of pressure on the Syrian Democratic Forces and the AANES. This has a knock-on effect with the ability of the de facto government and its forces to deal with these forces, because they themselves have to think about their own internal longevity. And if you don't have any internal longevity, then that poses a problem for not only for this non-state actor, but also the potential of its ability to maintain security of the al-Hol camp. Now, a lot of the time we have special envoy for, I would say not special envoy, yeah, I guess special envoy for, sorry, I'm just having water. Special envoy for Syria, James Jeffrey, essentially out making the SDF, or the Syrian Democratic Forces, to be a private military contractor or a professional guard for the al-Hol camp. The US coalition thanks the SDF for its continued support against the war against ISIS and its continued support at managing al-Hol camp, but at the same time it does little to actually relieve its partner, local indigenous partner force, of the pressure that it has. It's having the knowledge that if Turkey decides to invade the rest of the northeast in the near future, that could put a potential risk of many ISIS detainees and their family members escaping. I mean, at the moment in al-Hol camp, there are already smuggling operations that help these individuals actually get out. Yeah. The thing is that, and thank you for Kaki if you're still listening to this. I'm going to, if you want, you can come on a bit in about like 5 or 10 minutes. I just want to quickly finish up this point. But Kaki's information, along with many other researchers of the OSINT community on Twitter, as well as in the community at large, they live in the northeast of Syria, or even the north of Rojava, as we call it. These individuals are very important when it comes to their research on this matter, because we only are getting sort of glimpses of it. What Kaki has showed over here is that, especially in the article that you can find actually in the description box once I've completed this podcast, you'll find very detailed information of conversations, mostly in Arabic as well as other languages, of these volunteers who they talk about smuggling operations. They talk about various radicalization programs that they're having for their children. They talk about the money they use from public funds sometimes that they get from donations, and how they use it to make bombs or try and make bombs within the camp. That's worrying. That's a security risk, not just for the local area, but also poses a wider security risk for other nations as well. Which actually brings me back to the question of that I started off the stream with. And that has to do with, let me get back to this last slide. It has to do with what should be done about these Daesh volunteers. Now, I personally believe, it's my belief actually, that countries, states especially, whether they be in the EU or not, should repatriate not only their fighters that went off to fight in the Islamic State, but also the families as well. Allowing non-state actors such as the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Hashd al-Shabi, as well as flawed states such as the Syrian state and the Iraqi state, as well as the de facto government of the self-administration of North and East Syria, or the AANES, to continue to deal with these individuals is irresponsible, because as I mentioned before, these states simply, and these states and non-state actors, are either flawed in their judicial methods, either have the lack of funding or dealing with existential issues, or they simply just can't deliver the ability to secure not only state actors' national security, but also also civilians of their own areas. Now, I just want to pose something to listeners who may come across this later. I just want you all to imagine for a moment that we have Turkey who invades the rest of northeast Syria. You can imagine, if you will, a lot of people fleeing al-Hol camp now, because it's a free-for-all now. And I want you to imagine some of these fighters regaining strength in the deserts of near Abu Bakr, or near the deserts of the Anbar province in Iraq, to name a few, reconsolidating and then relaunching attacks against not only US personnel but as well civilians in the area. Now I want you to imagine one of these fighters starts to organize effectively again and starts to conduct operations within Europe and within Australia and the United States. If you can imagine that, that's what is at stake. This is what is at stake for the world if it does not deal with this issue, because it is a pressing issue. I've just used the examples of Iraq and Syria, for example. I've talked about the issues when it comes to these states alone and the non-state actors within them, as well as the issues regarding judicial procedures and to do with legal mechanisms imposed upon these entities. I've talked about that. I've not even talked about Nigeria or Indonesia. I've not talked about groups like Boko Haram or al-Shabaab. I've not talked about any of these groups. Yet they still pose significant risks in other parts of the globe. I think the large problem is that a lot of people have forgotten that the Islamic State is an issue. They think that the end of the protest state means that there's victory against ISIS and they will never return again. That's the kind of Hollywood simplification that they may get. And I say to them, or those who may listen to the future of this, is to not be so quick and not be so self-conceited. Because this is a big issue, and it is going to become a big issue in the future if left unchecked. This is not the end of it. Far from it. And we have a duty to the victims of the ISIS, especially such as the Yazidis, such as the thousands of families, some survivors as well, those dealing with PTSD. We have a duty to them, to owe them a form of justice, to make sure that they themselves can also be helped. Because we have to be frank with ourselves, the handling of the Islamic State and the handling of the war against ISIS, yes, it's been successful on a military standpoint, but that's only a short-term victory. Long-term, it has not yet to consider the long-term ramifications. And because of this, not only its narrow focus on just purely battling Islamic State fighters, but also its lack of ability to extend its view, to acknowledge things like the Syrian conflict, to acknowledge the destruction caused by it, to acknowledge the sheer failed state nature of both Iraq and Syria, and their abilities to actually maintain any form of long-term security. Now, this doesn't mean that there's complete lack of hope, but we must consider these things, and especially if we're talking about foreign policy matters, it does pose a substantial risk to national security, not only for state actors, but also poses a potential humanitarian issue that can arise in places like Syria and Iraq, a continuing, I should say, humanitarian crises. And that has a knock-on effect. The reason why this matters at all is because it has a knock-on effect to everyone else on the planet in some way or form. We must not forget what the Islamic State did, not only to Iraq but also to Syria, as well as the thousands of refugees that fled to the European Union, fled to European Union countries. And we must remember also the crises that it posed and the rise of right-wing nationalism in response to that. These all have knock-on effects, ladies and gentlemen. They all have knock-on effects to the country at large. This is why they must be addressed early, while they're still in their infancy, or like when they're still in their developing process. Because if left unchecked, this becomes a big issue, and it becomes much more harder to combat and much more complicated. So rather than fight a war in the future, or fight a war in the future where thousands more will die, we instead address this issue in the near future, or like in the immediate vicinity as best we can, because that's what we should all be doing, or at least what all these organizations, whether it be NGOs or non-state actors or multilateral organizations such as the United Nations, all these entities and their larger bodies need to do something about this. And as I said before, my proposals would be to create some form of international criminal tribunal to trial ISIS fighters, to help fund essentially the restoration of the infrastructure of the countries such as Iraq, and especially to fund and help the survivors of the Islamic State. I would also say to provide financial aid as well as security to our local indigenous partners, whether they be the Iraqi security forces or Syrian Democratic Forces. And if we don't want to take back these people, if we want to just leave these states or non-state actors to deal with them, then I would say at least give them the resources to do so and give them the means to do so. Unfortunately, we don't see either of that happening at the moment, but I think it needs to happen, because we can't have it one way where we say, okay, these people don't belong on our soil and we're not going to take responsibility, and then we not give essentially the means or the proper assistance to those countries that we're essentially giving our responsibility to. In other words, we want to try pretend as if the Islamic State never happened. That's what we're going to try and do. Unfortunately, that's a bad move. Just long term, just everything. It's a bad move to pretend the problem does not exist, because it does, and it is a national security issue that must be addressed in order to not only safeguard the nation's security of your state or whatever, but also civilian life and the humanitarian cost that could happen as well. Now, with that, I will now try to open it up to people who are still listening. I don't know if I've not checked really on the stream lately, but I will open it up to people who want to come and join to talk about this issue if they should want to. Okay, so with that said, this ends the first part of the episode. This episode covered the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, as well as foreign fighters who went to fight, as well as volunteers who are in detention by forces such as the SDF, and who are currently at the moment under the state apparatuses of these different entities and different groups, security apparatus, I should say, and whether or not, essentially exploring the question of what should be done about Daesh volunteers or ISIS volunteers. My name has been, it has been nice to talk about, at least we can say important to talk about this topic. But with that said, I'm going to now just open it up to potential questions. So if people who don't want to listen to the questions, I guess they can leave right now. Other than that, I'm just going to now open it up to the floor. So anyone who wants to ask a question, please do. I'm going to link the art. I'm going to eventually link all these articles to the description box. So I'm just going to now. I'm just now going to get the link for people so they can join. Okay, turkey. So give me a bit of time. So if you got a question, okay. I have I believe I have at least one question I can get to in my chat. Someone has actually asked me a question. Yep. I think I can also, I guess, link people as well to the chat. I'm going to try and get some people on to actually talk about this if they want to. I've got the link to the Discord server, actually. because it's just in case anyone wants to talk about it. Again, if you can, try look with yep. Sorry about the typing. Yeah. If there's no one who's gonna ask anything, I'll just leave this open for about another 5 minutes and see if there's anyone who'll want to ask anything. It's mostly related to the topic matter. I was just trying my best to keep it under an hour and 40 minutes, not to make it as long as my other past podcasts. The reason why I started really this podcast is to try bring awareness of topics that are not really covered as much by bigger media or corporations, or have not been really sort of have been forgotten about really by people. So yeah. Yep. Okay. Okay, I've got one question here. That's someone in my messages. They ask, what will the Syrian Democratic Forces do about ISIS if there is an invasion of the northeast? Okay, that question was from Mr. Roberto. I would actually say that if such an invasion had to happen, as I mentioned before, I think the Syrian Democratic Forces are likely going to try their best to maintain some form of order when it comes to that camp. But I do think that it's going to be very hard pressed to do such, because with an incoming invasion, more forces are going to have to be redeployed to the lines to defend against other civilian infrastructure and other civilians as well. So trying to utilize all forces to al-Hol camp becomes less of an issue anymore in those kind of circumstances, which I suspect if such an invasion happens, they may have to do a deal with the Assad regime or the Russian state or the subsequent states to, transfer these prisoners, or they'll maybe potentially, I wouldn't see the Syrian Democratic Forces doing this, but they might actually abandon the camp if it gets to that stage. Because the last time when Operation Peace Spring was happening in October to November of 2019, there was artillery that was fired near al-Hol camp, and a lot of prisoners actually escaped from al-Hol camp, as well as other nearby other detention facilities, just due out of the chaos, really. Because there's this hope that the chaos will bring about an avenue for escape for a lot of these volunteers and fighters. So I think that with that said, we just have to be very careful, really, with how, if any invasion is going to happen, we're going to make sure that those prisoners, at least, as well as civilian life, is not really, how I can say, endangered. But it's a very big issue, I think, and that's going to have to be addressed in the future, especially by the international community, because as I mentioned before, it is irresponsible that nothing has been done really nothing of substance has been done collectively by the international community outside of a small number of individual acts and individual state acts has been done to address this pressing issue. Because as the United States is dealing with internal issues, and as Turkey and other such countries are further embroiling themselves in other wars, and then you put on COVID on top of this as well, it's just a very bad set of events that can lead to even worse events if left unchecked, as I mentioned before. Like, one of the issues is that ISIS can reconsolidate, and then ISIS 2.0 can come. I mean, some have already speculated that ISIS 2.0 is here already in places like Kirkuk and other such areas within places like Kurdistan and Iraq. Like, there's a big issue that people are going to have for these places, is that what's going to happen with these, with these places, if we can't, if essentially there's nothing to, like, I guess no form of like security and no form of stability. I think another thing to note as well is that when it comes to the ideology of the Islamic State, we're not seeing much counter-radicalization happen within the camp. Now, I know that UNICEF has established what it calls the UNICEF Support Self-Learning at Hall Camp, which is has set up 3 learning centers where it reaches quote-unquote 5,500 children. Now, this is the United Nations attempt at trying to give children within the camp a right to proper education, as well as people within the camp to education. This is mostly to try de-radicalize the other counter ideology that has been pushed by these ISIS wives. And that is the issue, because it's like trying to counter that extremist ideology. It's not easy. It simply is not easy to counter the extremist ideology. There's a huge issue that will happen with that extremist ideology that needs to be addressed. And I think that the only way you can really do that is by actually taking these children away from their parents. But again, then that raises questions from both a legal and ethical basis. But again, it's not right either to allow these children to be radicalized by extremist parents, because, as I said before, it poses a national security risk in the long run. It poses a risk to society in general, because you have potentially mujahideen being trained, and it's bad for the child's life as well. So this is what's very concerning, is that we need to consider the children really here who are being radicalized in al-Hol camp. I mean, what can be done about them? I really do think that they need to be separated from their these women. But then the question arises: where do you separate them to? Like, where are you going to put the kids, basically, away from their mothers? And what then? Who's going to take care of those children? It's a huge problem, because it really goes to the point that there's not enough being done. Like, there honestly is not enough being done. Even like in Australia here, the Scott Morrison government has renounced the citizenship of every Australian ISIS volunteer, and a lot of Australians, as well as I guess a lot of British people who may celebrate, all those states may celebrate that, we don't want these people basically coming back to our states because, they killed those people and all that kind of stuff. And I understand their sentiments, and they don't really give a shit, basically. But they don't understand the long term. They don't understand, you could say, the wider implications, the wider policy implications of just allowing essentially giving away your responsibility of that you should have as a state actor, giving away this responsibility, and all out of this presence that, okay, you don't want to deal with them because they're not our problem anymore. That's the thing about it, is that it's not like that simple. You can't just like throw away responsibility and just expect, oh gosh, it's not a problem, and these people committed crimes, who gives a shit about them? And I don't honestly give a shit about them either, but again, you're not thinking about the ramifications. You're not thinking about the children. You're not thinking about, I know that sounds very cliche, you're not thinking about the children, but you're also not thinking about the victims as well. You're not thinking about the actual wider judicial process. You're not thinking about the future of the ramifications it could do when this stuff comes back to bite you, really. Now, there's a comment by a man by the name of, I assume not man, but just an anon, really, by the name of Lucifer Trestes. This person says, education is the key. These children have been brought up with a mindset radicalizing education. Exactly. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's radicalized education. It's not really education, I would say it's indoctrination. Because you have a lot of these women who are educating these children in the al-Hol camp and other such camps. They're educating them in a radical Salafist jihadist ideology. That's something that they did under the Islamic State, where those children, who themselves most likely are scarred and traumatized, have been brought up in this environment where they're the equivalent of child soldiers eventually in the future, where they don't have remorse, or they have not been brought up the same way to have some form of empathy for those that, it's like empathy for loved ones. Basically, they don't have that knowledge, skill. If you indoctrinate the child in a radical ideology, they're going to become radicals. There's a logical, it's like logical, really. If you've seen some of the pictures that Kaki actually has put into that article, which I will link in the description box, if you look at that, you'll look at the pictures, and some of the pictures that they draw of blood and guts, of beheadings and that. It's very gruesome that children do these stuff, that children draw this stuff, that children want this and cheer for it. It's very worrying. Another comment by Lucifera Trestes is, everything westernized is considered radical by the Daesh volunteers, wanting the best of two worlds. That's the thing. They as you mentioned, it's funny that they use technology developed in the West, mostly developed by Israel, for example, when it comes to chips within phones. They use that technology to preach how the West is bad and how westernization is bad and how secularization is bad, while simultaneously using westernized and secularized devices in order to spread their propaganda and their indoctrination to children. So it's a bit of hypocritical thing. It's hypocritical. Lucifero Tristes says, nothing wrong with that really, but it's too indoctrinated education. I agree. It's just too indoctrinized in education. I mean, I prefer these children should have a proper education where they're actually taken away from this radical environment, where they're allowed to be the future of their own states, like, proper decent individuals for their own states. Because we're not thinking about really a lot of these children's futures at the moment. We're kind of thinking as if, okay, we've let these volunteers come to the state and it's not our problem anymore. But what about the children? I know it's a cliche to say it, but what about the children? Because aren't they the state's responsibility? Are you saying that they don't get any of their citizenship? Are you saying that, okay, we're just going to allow them to be indoctrinated, really, by these women? Yeah, you may say, okay, we'll renounce the citizenship of fighters who voluntarily went, as well as women who voluntarily went. But what about the children that they had? Where do they go? They never wanted to be born in that world. They were born in that place. Okay? So what happens with them? And that's the question that is never really answered. It's just these states have a very hypocritical way of doing things, I think. That I shouldn't be really surprised, but it's kind of flawed from a logical standpoint as well as from a national security standpoint. I mean, I'm sure that policy advisors of different states must get this through. I mean, I know the United States, for example, is doing essentially the heavy lifting when it comes to, even the war against ISIS in general, does the heavy lifting for everyone when it comes to military operations across the world. I mean, the US does the most funding when it comes to the United Nations. It does the most funding when it comes to the NATO. It did the most fighting when it came to backing the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Iraqi security forces against the Islamic State. It did the most fighting for all these places. Difficulties are there. Did the fighting for all these states, yet it's not. It can't do everything. I know that I'm not really a fan of the Trump administration for a number of different reasons, but Trump is right when he says that more responsibility for defense must go to these states, because it goes on to it goes on to the topic that we've just talked about. Because when states start to take responsibility for their defense, they become much more interested, much more focused on national security. I know France, for example, France has sort of reversed its policies on repatriation, and has actually started to take in people again. But the thing about it is that France, I guess, under Macron, notices the national security and the long-term national security implications of just allowing essentially these fighters to be left unhindered unhinged, like to be left on there with their own devices. So I think that really that's just an issue that will be coming for the future that will need to be looked out for. On that matter, actually, if there's no other questions, if anyone else is listening, I can stay for about another 5 minutes, if that's okay. If anyone wants to just say any last questions, if there are any questions in the future. Of course, all the resources that I mentioned will be linked in the description box attached to this video. This is the first podcast of Through the Looking Glass, or TTLG. It's going to be the start. I'll hopefully do it every Saturday. We will cover a different topic, and hopefully I'll bring about a bit more guests on this time. And I'll talk a bit more on a different topic matter. I thought that we would just start off with this topic at the moment. But with that said, I'm going to actually close the stream off. This has been Through the Looking Glass, or TTLG, Episode 1, What Should Be Done About Daesh Volunteers. It's a podcast that deals with examining issues related to foreign policy and foreign affairs, examining current global affairs and reflecting on pressing questions and providing thoughts from a young adult's perspective, taking a look at this confusing world through the looking glass. And I have been Anthony Avista Bisson. I am a freelance writer. I contribute to a number of online syndications such as the Region RA Magazine and the Jerusalem Post. And I thank you all for actually listening. It's very important that I raised this topic. I think I don't want to sound self-congratulatory at all, but I think that a lot of these topics aren't talked about much. So, thank you for listening.